Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining our virtual chat on creating a work community built to respond in crisis. Just a quick tech overview. This conversation is scheduled for 45 minutes. It'll be a conversation between our panelists, Meka Este-McDonald and Angela Cheng-Cimini. And all attendees are welcome to submit questions throughout in the chat. And if there's an opportunity, we'll submit them to the panelists to address during the conversation. A reminder that every attendee is on mute, and we will follow up afterward with a recording from this conversation, so everyone will be able to watch it afterward and share it as you would like. Just a quick note on why Canary is hosting this conversation today. We're hosting the conversation about how HR can support their employee community in a changing world, especially in response to crisis. Because Canary's technology and services enable our clients, including employers like Harvard Business Publishing, to give individuals money at pivotal moments in their lives with dignity and efficiency. And with that said, I want to welcome Canary's founder and CEO, Rachel Schneider, who will introduce our panelists today.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And thank you so much, Angela and Meka, for doing this. I wanted to be on because I wanted to acknowledge how spectacular these two people are and give a little background about why we invited them to do it. So Angela, I first came into contact with at HR Transform last year, and she was on a panel talking about community in general and how to build community at work. And what we do at Canary is around financial services, but we very much see it as a piece of how you build Canary, and so sort of how you build community. And so I was so pleased and honored, really, that she agreed to become an advisor to Canary, and just really have appreciated her insight and advice over the last few months tremendously. And so I'm excited for you all to get to benefit from those insights and advice as well. And my colleague Meka, who joined Canary in the spring, is one of the most curious and insightful questioners that I engage with in my life. He is just really always looking for the answer. And so I'm excited to be able to listen along and see what kinds of questions he comes up with and how he's processing information alongside the rest of us as we listen to this conversation. You know, we really want to build something that's useful to our users. And so I hope that as you're thinking about this general conversation and the general topic, you'll reach out to us with any thoughts you have about not necessarily how we can be helpful with our specific product, because that's not what this conversation's about, but about how you think about community and the financial lives of your workforce, because that's really complicated and raising really new questions for people, leaders, and companies as they think about what does it mean to establish community while also enabling their employees to be autonomous and independent and maintain privacy. And we're in a complicated moment on all those issues. So I really look forward to the dialogue, and thank you both so much for doing it.
Thank you for having us.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Angela, for being here. And kind of bouncing off of that introduction from Rachel, why don't we start by talking a little bit about your view on HR's responsibility in creating community, and what is something that maybe you're really proud of having done at Harvard to foster community? And your answer does not have to be Canary. All other answers are acceptable.
Okay, well, that's implied, right? I'm so pleased to be here. We just recently announced the launch of Canary, actually just yesterday, as part of our open enrollment. And the reception so far has been really positive. I think people are attuned to the ways in which they're looking for help, and the employer has not always been that place. So Canary is an important prong for us in terms of helping the organization be a dimension of their lives where they can seek meaning, not just for the paycheck and not just for the work, but they can indeed find community. Just one caveat, I am struggling a little bit with bandwidth. So I just want to explain that the lag is not me. It is me, it's not you. So the question was about how employers can help establish community. Was that right, Meka?
Exactly, yeah.
I think our responsibility in HR is not to build community, but to help all leaders in the organization help build community, right? We have the experience, we have the expertise, we have the R&D that shows what's effective and what's not. But to say that HR is solely responsible is taking too much of the responsibility on our own shoulders, right? That's not our own burden to share. And I think that's a conversation that we continually have with leaders, particularly rising leaders, right? That their responsibility is to get the work done through their people, right? It's not to drive numbers, it's not to execute on the plan, it's to support their people so that they can drive the numbers so that they can execute on the plan. So in very much the same way, building community is how does HR enable their leaders to do that? Not so much directly how does HR do that. Certainly we have a hand, but I would be reluctant to say that it's our responsibility alone.
So that's interesting. So in some ways, it's like HR's responsibility is to create community builders, and then they are the ones who will go through the process of actually making the community. And maybe then the way to kind of adjust that question is there sort of a success story of a leader who was not building community, and then you sort of were able to influence them to do something that you found really cool, and that played out, that arc that you talked about sort of empowering somebody else to then do the sort of final step of community building?
Oh, that's a really good question. So unfortunately, my experience has been that if a leader doesn't understand that it's important, that's really difficult. If a leader doesn't know how, that's a very different conversation, right? And I have in my experience worked for both. Those who just don't think that it's an employer's responsibility to be thinking about culture, to be thinking about inclusion, to be thinking about belonging, to be thinking about community, and that their responsibility is to think about, quote, the business, and it doesn't include those factors. But for those who understand that it's important but just don't know how, I've got all the time in the world for that. So what that means is one-on-one conversations. It means getting together with their teams. It means sharing experiences, sharing stories about what feels right and what doesn't feel right. It means a lot of listening. It actually means a lot less talking than we might suppose. And I find that that's the superpower of most really successful organizations, is that they really lean in and listen to what their community needs, to what their employees need.
Great. Yeah, no. So I think, I had a follow-up question about sort of when is an attempt to build community kind of fallen flat, but it kind of sounds like it's almost like if the leader is already leaning in that direction, it's really easy. If the leader kind of doesn't have that intrinsically, it can be really hard. I guess what do you do when you are dealing with a leader that just doesn't have that sort of intrinsic desire to create community? Is that just like, that's just not somebody you want to work with, or like how do you kind of, these people exist, so what do we do with them?
I think to a fault, I do try to convert them. I do try to proselytize what it means to be an enlightened leader. I think I have over-indexed in my past and tried for too long, to the point of exhaustion, to the point of frustration. And I have personally learned that in those environments, I just need to exit. Because I'm not making the kind of impact that I find gratifying. But for those leaders who start to get it, like I said before, I've got all the time in the world for that. And I see some of the participants and I recognize some of those names, some that I've worked with in the past and some that I work with now. And I think you all sort of understand both of those journeys, right? What it looks like to work with a leadership team who really intrinsically gets it, and those who just stubbornly refuse.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for that. So I kind of moving on from that topic to more of the idea of like spotting signs of trouble in your community. There are obvious signs for there being financial stress in your workforce, people directly asking for help, informal GoFundMes, things of that sort. But are there other indicators that you've seen that suggest that people are dealing with financial stressors that are actually affecting them at work?
Yeah, I think you're right. Stress in all dimensions, right? Not just financial stress, manifest themselves in poor performance and tardiness and disengagement and people leaving the organization. I think our concern are those that fight so hard not to show that they need help. Right. It's the signs that are hidden, and those are the people who are most in need because they don't think that if they come forward, they can get the help. Spoiler alert, that's why Canary is so powerful. right? Because it is a completely discrete and private transaction that happens between the employee and Canary. My HR team will not see any of those transactions. We won't know any of the details, but I can know that people have an avenue for help when and if they need it.
Well, thank you for the shout out. Appreciate that. But yeah, so I think, but what's interesting about what you said there is, almost like this expectation that for certain people and certain types of financial stressors and certain types of the things that they're dealing with, you can expect that the data is not going to be there beforehand, that this exists. And so how do you kind of make decisions to invest time and money in programs like a Canary, but not just that, but sort of deal with these hidden issues that your work population is dealing with? How do you kind of make that decision in a low data environment?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. I think that what that means is that you've got to look for the data. So when I was talking about listening, so really diving deep into organizations, leaning in, checking in with managers, checking in with employees directly. So what initiated this for me with Canary was that I had heard about one of our employees who was doing, who had started Uber driving, moonlighting, and then got into a car crash and totaled their car. And so they could no longer do their moonlighting gig, and they had already tapped out all their other available sources of income. And this story came to me, and so I was brainstorming with that manager about what we could do. And we sort of ran out of options. Fortunately, this was a superlative employee who was due for a promotion, so we accelerated that, so we were able to give them a pay raise. But that was sort of serendipity, right? All those things converging at that time. If this was an employee who wouldn't necessarily be able to access a pay raise, what were we going to do for that person?
Right.
So it was on that, that I started thinking about, well, we'd really have to get more creative, and we have to find ways for people to raise their hand for help, even when they don't think anybody's listening.
Yeah. And it sounds like in some ways there needs to be like a comfort with extrapolating from anecdotal data rather than like trends within sort of the vast majority of your employee community. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the HR team at HVP does really well is that we'll all take that call. None of us says, well, that's not our responsibility, that's not our wheelhouse. We understand in complete holisticness that the HR team is there to support employees. So it doesn't matter if they're in talent acquisition, doesn't matter if they're in organizational effectiveness, doesn't matter if they're in benefits, right? That each one of us is there to answer that call. And I would like to see that extension of goodwill from all our people leaders as well, right? So again, back to the original premise that HR is not the sole responsible party for culture and community.
Definitely. So and kind of building on that though, like there's sort of a sense of proactiveness in going from that one story of moonlighting as an Uber driver and a car crash to then building something for other people who might run into that. I guess, what is your kind of philosophy on HR being proactive versus reactive and waiting for more signs that this is not an isolated incident, that we have many other people who might be dealing with something similar, but that evidence hasn't rolled in yet, but we're still going to be proactive and put something in place to make sure that when other people are dealing with that, we're ready. Like, how do you kind of think about that proactive reactive spectrum?
Oh, I think that's the ongoing challenge of anybody who has responsibility for people. Because there are things that land on our desk that demand our immediate attention, and you can't turn away from them because there is someone in need, right? There is a moment of crisis for that person. And so how do you balance that with finding the time to be strategic, to look around corners, to find those curveballs that might happen and that may never come, right? So when we talk about anticipating the issues that are happening globally, societally, we couldn't possibly imagine, right, that there would be a war in Ukraine. I certainly couldn't imagine that Roe v. Wade was going to be overturned, but we were thinking about those things because we were seeing some signs and we were preparing for our organizational response. And there's 1,000 of those instances, right? And we just can't possibly anticipate them all. So we try to be proactive. We try to think ahead. I can't think of the last time I sat in a 5-year strategic plan setting because it's too far out. It's too far out, right? I mean, I think it's sort of reasonable to think 2 or 3 years out, but 5 years out, the world is just so unpredictable right now. So there is a limit to being proactive. And so to the extent that when we're reactive, I want to be as responsive as possible. I want to be as humane as possible. That's sort of the balance that we can try to strike.
And yeah, so that actually leads really nicely into this next question, talking about sort of the maybe, I don't know if there's an increase, but there certainly seems to be a heightened awareness of these types of crises, that there is no option but to be reactive and kind of be crisis managers. And obviously the major one being COVID, where that affects everybody. But the war in Ukraine, depending on your company, could affect you in different ways. And you kind of started to touch on it in terms of like, there's only so much you can do in advance, but like, how do you think about preparing a work community for the various ways that crisis can show up, and potentially be sort of all-encompassing when it does?
But I think in that instance, right, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So if every instance in which we touch an employee, when we deal with a crisis, when we help them through, we help them build confidence that the organization that they belong to is going to respond in the right way. That's not to say that we're perfect, right? Sometimes we get it wrong. In that case, we apologize and we do a reset and we do it over again. We try to get better. So I know that my team, we do our very best to try to extend compassion and time and a listening ear, so that people know that if something else does come, right, that they're part of an organization that lives by their values, that walks the talk, that is willing to invest their time and energy into ways in which they can support their people. And again, Canary, I think, is a really good example of that.
Yeah. So and then with kind of and you were starting to touch on it, but like the other side of these crises is the kind of the emotional side, and the various ways that people deal with crises, whether it's anger, whether it's frustration. We're not always our best selves when we are dealing with crisis. How do you kind of think about the ways that HR can kind of meet people where they are in those moments?
We do it all the time. I feel like my team and I, we should probably go through some sort of for lack of a word, like EMT training, right? Like, how do we, in the moment, pull someone back? And in fact, we just certified 21 of our employees in mental health first aid as a way to provide another layer of safety within our organization, so that people have resources amongst their colleagues that they can turn to, because those people understand their work environment. But it's something that you gain with experience. And hopefully it comes with some intuition as well, right? That we have a built-in sense of compassion that just teaches us when to put an arm around someone, when to give them space, when to escalate the issue, when to know, you know what, I don't know the answer to that. Let me go find some other resources, because this one's new for me. And increasingly, right, the COVID was all about that, right? Nobody had a playbook for that. And we were sort of making that up as we went along. And as often as I would talk to other HR leaders, we were all like brainstorming together how we did that. And I'm particularly proud of the way our organization responded to that. And for many, many months, probably for the first 9 months after we returned to office, we didn't have any evidence that there was any in-office transmission. We just went way out of our way to make sure that our employees were safe, that they knew that they had the right supports and the right resources to offer when they did come into the office.
And so, yeah, you kind of started to touch on it with COVID. Do you feel like COVID changed your view on what the role of HR is in workers' lives, or do you feel like it was just a natural extension of what HR has always done?
Not for me, because I've been trying to choose organizations that understand the value of HR, but I know that for a lot of my colleagues, the pandemic finally gave them a seat at a table, because it was all about people, and because people didn't know what to do, they sort of naturally just turned to their HR leadership and said, well, why don't you go figure it out? And then once we get a seat at the table, we're not going to let it go. So again, for me, I've been fortunate to be with an organization, again, HVP, that really understood that the people response to this was going to be paramount. But for a lot of my colleagues, it was finally a recognition that HR can be a strategic partner in how the business operates.
Yeah, I think that's, and I think I'm going to circle back to this, but this sort of evolving nature of HR's role and its increasing seat at the table, I think has been really an interesting thing to watch over the past couple of decades. When we talk about sort of getting that seat at the table and what it's kind of indicative of is sort of a recognition of employer responsibility relative to some of these things. And that's sort of why that seat is being created or given in some places where it hadn't been before. And we're seeing, I don't know if it's an explosion, but certainly there's a lot of different types of benefits being offered that weren't being offered before, whether it's mental health, whether that's fertility. People are now giving pet insurance, I guess, if, you know, we gotta love each other's pets and all that fun stuff. But since, you know, you seem to be one of these teams that are prioritizing these extra offerings, if you want to call them extra, how do you think about an employer's responsibility? Like, what is the baseline and what is extra? I mean, it maybe you think of all of it as the baseline, but how do you kind of think about that spectrum between baseline to extra?
Oh, that's such a tough question, Meka, because our traditional safety nets are failing us. Mm-hmm. And so I find that increasingly employers are the ones who have to provide that. But why is it that employers are the ones who have to shoulder health insurance, as an example? Right, if I look in the United States government has the scale, has the buying power to provide health insurance for every single member of its community. Mm-hmm. And yet it's private insurance that is the predominant way through which people carry insurance. So when we talk about an employer's responsibility to take care of their people, I want to do that, but I think it's also really unfair to those organizations who simply cannot. Right? I worked for a startup organization, pre-revenue, didn't have 2 dimes to scratch together to do that. I worked for a nonprofit. You know, they're just trying to pay a decent or living wage. So for them to ask them to sponsor these extras, and then to shame them because they can't, or to somehow pass judgment on them because they can't, is really, really unfair, right? I think it's because all the other things that we would expect of our society, of our government, have failed. So I'm glad that I'm part of an organization that can sponsor Canary, but for everyone that can, there's probably 5 that want to who cannot. So you know, it's a noble cause, but we have so far to go for everybody to understand that they have a role to play to make sure that people have access to healthcare, that they have access to equal rights, that they have access to a decent living wage, and for all of that to be put upon an employer. I mean, if you're working for a mom and pop laundromat, how can they possibly do all those things?
Right. So this kind of, and it's a tough question, so I apologize in advance, but like, I guess like, but, you know, you're kind of mentioning, like, you know, some people simply can't afford to give some of these extras, or maybe even the baseline. But some people very clearly can afford it, right? And so then the question becomes, I guess, like how do you think about like a company's relative responsibility based to, for lack of a better term, its financial success? Like, is it?
Oh my gosh, Meka, are we going to go there? You know, I was as I was driving in today, I was hearing about oil prices, and how the major oil companies, I forget which one it is, Mobil, Sunoco, Exxon, choose one, $9.3 billion in profit. They're raking it in. They're raising gas prices at a time of inflation, at a time of great social unrest. Absolutely. Personally, I believe they should be slashing the price of gas per gallon, right? So that people can go to work, so that people can go to the supermarket and buy fresh fruit and vegetables for their family. I think there's a tremendous imbalance. I'm not sure if that's what this audience necessarily wants to hear, because that's a little bit of a personal rant. But I do think that to the extent that organizations can afford to take care of their employees, whether it's morally, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, yes, they should.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, for one of the things that we kind of, you know, deal with at Canary, just, I guess maybe this will be a little bit my own personal rant, is sort of like how much, for example, could they afford to invest in their funds here, like relative to their employees? And I think it's a hard question to answer, and it's a hard sort of business case to make in terms of like, what is the right way to think about sizing the amount that you're helping them with financial insecurity versus mental health. Like, like you can invest some, but like how much to invest in the mental health of your employees, and things of that sort. But let's reel it back into a safer waters, and maybe talk about some of the other tools beyond Canary and that you might kind of consider extra, that you are providing to your employees over there at Harvard.
Yeah, so I talked about the mental health first aid. That's a partnership we have with the National Council of Wellbeing. I heard about that from a friend of mine who worked for an organization where they had an employee commit suicide, and they were completely unprepared for the aftermath. They just did not know how to have the conversation with their employees around how to come back from that. And this is an instance actually where where we tried to be a little proactive. I know that right now, many of our employees are probably struggling with all sorts of levels of mental unwellness, right, to different degrees. But again, my hope is that investing in this first cohort of 21, that will then provide a safety net for them. So that's one thing that I'm really proud of. The energy around that effort has been super high, and the response has been really good. We've also invested in a financial wellness program through a company called Smart Path Financial, and they provide unlimited amounts of coaching, counseling with financial planners. They have courses online, asynchronous and live, so that people can start to put their affairs in order. How much should they save? How do they pay down their credit debt? How do they plan for college? How do they plan for retirement? And it's free to them because HVP is paying for that, and financial advisors come with a cost. And so the fact that we're able to provide that for free is something that I'm really proud of as well. So I'm always on the lookout for innovative ways to support our employees.
Love that. So the kind of when you do provide multiple things, I think then the next challenge is like making sure that people are aware of all that is available to them. I know that I've been in many a place that includes an employee handbook, and my thoroughness of reading said employee handbook has not always been at its highest, and it's a challenge even at Canary to make sure that the companies that we work with, that the employee population knows that this is something that they can take advantage of. But how do you kind of think about that, helping employees navigate the range of things that you offer?
Yeah, so I mean, we have an intranet, so we're constantly using that as a resource so that people can go there because it lives there evergreen. Obviously, the HR team is a great resource for that, but also just making sure that our managers, our people leaders, understand what's available to them and to their employees so that they can be a first line of defense when someone says, hey, I've got this challenge, and they say, actually, I've got a pamphlet for that, or I've got a link for that. So we have to do a lot more campaigning, a lot more education. Open enrollment right now is in full swing for us. So that's the opportune time for us to do that. But we have to make sure that we're continually pushing the message that we have a whole suite of resources and a whole cadre of employees and associates and colleagues who want to help.
Yeah. And sometimes even when you are sort of doing that sort of internal marketing, if you will, usage might still be low of certain tools that you have. And so how do you kind of assess the success of tools, some of which maybe you hope that people aren't availing themselves of too much because you don't
exactly.
want
But I think for Canary, it's a little bit like that, right? I mean, if nobody ever has to apply for an emergency fund, that's great. But I think just knowing that it exists gives solace, right? I think we've seen a lot of uptake in EAP as well since the pandemic, and that was probably a benefit that people didn't know. I recently had a testimonial for someone who took use of our legal aid assistance. She was going through a guardianship battle, and she signed up for that. And without that, she would not have been able to have the resources or the knowledge to get through what was a very, very foreign journey for her. So sometimes it's just a moment in time, and you realize you need something, and then you find out that it's there. And other times it's knowing that it's there and knowing that you never have to access it provides a level of security and comfort that doesn't have a price tag.
Yeah. And I guess, as you're reviewing, whether it's annually or quarterly, whatever the case is, the sort of the set of things that you have chosen to provide to your employees, how do you kind of continue to make the case that they are valuable, even if maybe the usage is low, and that they should roll over into the next year and we should do it again, whether or not the usage was high? Is there other sort of things that you're looking at to say, no, this is valuable for other reasons?
I think we try to be pretty intentional because clawing back benefits is always a little sticky, because you can usually find at least one use case where someone was like, oh my God, I loved that. You can't take it, right?
Right.
Even in the face of 599 other people who did not. So we
Yeah.
try to be pretty cautious around the things that we supplement to our programs, because I'd like them to be evergreen, because again, part of the message is it's there even if you never have to use it.
Right.
So, things like EAP, that's never going away, right?
Right.
And there was a long time and it wasn't greatly used. And then the pandemic hit. Who could have possibly forecasted that? And all of a sudden, we're so grateful to have that. So, some things are more obvious. There was the childcare option that I was vetting, and I threw out a survey and people were like, no, this doesn't really work. And so we chose not to go with that. So we try and do outreach to the organization as well, to balloon test people, to balloon test ideas to see whether or not there will be interest. And there have been a couple that just kind of fell flat. So we try to do that as well.
Okay. And kind of, I guess in the same vein, right? I think a lot of these benefits, some of the main framings for why they'll be useful is either that they'll increase productivity or that they'll increase retention, which are great. They're both really hard to measure in terms of like the actual impact of that. Are those the common framings that you think of when you think of some of these extras, or is there something else that sometimes you lean on beyond just productivity and retention?
I think that's a really great point, Meka, because I think at the end of the day, you have to get the fundamentals right, because otherwise it's just window dressing, right? So you have to make sure that people feel heard. You have to make sure that people feel they belong, that they have opportunities for growth, that they're being valued both emotionally, technically, and in terms of their financial gains, right? If you miss all of those things, all these extras can almost serve to backfire, because it's like, you say you have all these programs, but you're not getting the simple things right. So we have to make sure that we're paying people well, that we're treating them with respect, that they have opportunities to develop their career, that we can fulfill their ambitions, that they work for someone who really values them and respects them. Because then the other stuff do become extras, right? Stuff that's icing on the cake. Otherwise, it's lipstick on a pig.
Yeah. Okay, so this is kind of a related topic, and we're kind of been circling the drain of this to some degree, but to kind of make it more explicit, what types of resistance, if any, have you faced internally for programs like this? And maybe not just at Harvard, since that's where you are currently. Maybe you don't want to throw anybody there under the bus, but like, we all have longer careers. So like, if you sort of abstract it away in general, what types of objections have you had to overcome to implement, some of these solutions that go beyond the paycheck?
Some of them are completely practical, right? Like I said, I worked for a startup who just didn't have two pennies to rub together. So it was out of the question. We just simply couldn't afford it. Or the nonprofit museum where I currently serve on the board, right? We're just trying to pay a decent living wage. So in those instances, right, I think it's easier to forgive. But when leadership again actively says no, sometimes you just have to unpack that a little bit, because they have to triage what's important. And if it's about the survival of the organization, then you kind of got to get in line. But hope that overall the priority is taking care of your people, so that when the fundamentals are in line, people can understand that they won't have all the bells and whistles. And again, I've worked for some leaders who get that and some who don't. And thankfully, right now, the organization that I'm a part of completely embraces the former. They get that.
Leadership is not a monolith, right? Sometimes you can have CEO support and not have CFO support. Right? Like there are times. So like, I guess whether it's 4 stories or like, where does the resistance tend to crop up most, even in a situation where it's like, it seems like this is going to be able to move forward because at least at the highest level, we have some support. But in order for this to go forward well, there are still some sort of internal sort of coalition that needs to kind of be built in, and that has some
there's always the practical implication, right? So your point about the CEO and the CFO and the CHRO, right? That's a really important triad, and we absolutely have to work to get them all online. So it always starts with the business case. How is this going to help the business? Why is spending the money here versus somewhere else going to advance our strategy, going to deliver on our mission? So it always starts with that. I fully expect those conversations with my CFO. And I'm happy to say that I win them more often than I lose.
I guess what is like some of the tools that you use to win that conversation? Like do you have sort of a framework for making a business case? And that kind of goes back to this retention productivity talk, but like what is kind of like some of the ways that you go about winning those conversations with the CFO?
Yeah, I mean, Canary came loaded with research around why financial wellness in this particular form of delivering it is helpful. And can drive productivity in organizations. So HR always has to come armed with data, right? We're often known as sort of the touchy-feely based on intuition function. We absolutely have to have our ducks in a row. We've got to get our numbers, our statistics, and the ROI ready to go. And so once you have that, then it's really easy to play on the heartstrings, and it feels really good to do.
Right.
But yeah, you always have to start with the business case for sure.
Yeah. Okay. And we're kind of moving relatively quickly, but the kind of one of the last areas I wanted to touch on was this idea of sort of taking a step back, this idea that the role of HR has kind of been evolving, and how HR leaders see themselves and how companies view the department is evolving. And you kind of mentioned sort of being touchy-feely, but now sort of becoming more and more of a strategic partner. There's sort of is it just about liability reduction, or is it about something more than that? You know, even the names are changing. We have chief happiness officers and people departments and all this sort of stuff. I kind of wanted to get your sense on that arc, like where kind of HR was in the past, where it is today, and where you imagine it might be in terms of its role in companies, call it in the next decade.
So yeah, I've seen a lot of stuff around the name change, you know, people operations and whatnot, and I'm less fussed with what we call a function and more concerned that people understand why we exist. Right? And for me, it's always been, we're an employee advocate first, business partner second, and then we're a change agent third, you know, or cultural advocate. And those things have to be in balance for this function to work really healthily and to serve its mission. Otherwise, you know, then we lose the seat at the table, right? If we're only all about the employees and we over-index and we forget that we have a business to run, whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit, right? Then people don't understand your role as a business partner. The culture bit we've talked about, right? I mean, it's everybody's responsibility to build great culture, but we're definitely the steward, right? We oversee, it's the thing that consumes us the most day in, day out. Just ask my head of diversity. We're constantly having conversations about how are we moving the needle on our culture, trying to get it to a place where everybody feels cherished. I've learned so much from her. So shout out to Ellen, because I see her on the call here. But yeah, I mean, a long time ago, it was because, you know, in the Industrial Revolution, employers took advantage. They put employees in unsafe places, in hospitable environments, underpaid them, overworked them. And so personnel came to be because people wanted a place to go. Managers knew that owners of businesses wanted a place to sort of shove all that stuff. And personnel kind of evolved around policies and programs and discipline and rigor, employment law, compliance. And we've now definitely gotten to the place where we're much more progressive thinking. It's interesting for me because I didn't imagine that over the course of my 30 years of being in HR that I would now see unions come back into the forefront. And I see that as a failure of organizations to take care of their people. I absolutely see that is why that is now happening, right? Organizations that treat their employees well, pay them fairly, give them safe, psychologically safe and physically safe environments probably won't hear a lot of talk about unions. It's because employees have run out of options that they're now looking for third-party representation. It's a really interesting dinner conversation I'm having with my daughter, who sees unions very differently than I do. Right? I believe that it will set up a really adversarial environment for employees to do that, but it has sort of come to that, right? And organizations failing to hear, failing to deliver. So they're forcing the hand of employees to go find someone else who can and will speak for them. So yeah, the evolution, it's ongoing, right? So we'll see whether or not unions will really get a toehold and regain the popularity and the dominance that they once had. So, but it'll probably be after I retire.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I hadn't really thought about, and then what becomes kind of the relationship, like what is the in this world where there may be more unions, what is HR's kind of role in interfacing with those unions? Like what,
Yeah.
and I have like literally no idea. You don't have to answer that question if you don't know, but I just literally
Well,
have never thought
in the early days of my career, I did quite a bit of labor relations and some union negotiation. And because it's adversarial, when I talk about things being in balance, right, the business partner piece kind of comes out of whack. You
Yeah.
cannot be as effective an employee advocate when either side is trying to get more for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a natural win-win dynamic. It's a
Mm-hmm.
win-more dynamic.
Yeah.
And so you are human resources in an organization that has third-party representation, that has a union. You have to lean into being more of a business partner and protecting the interests of the organization and not necessarily of the union who represents the people,
Yeah.
which is why I find that so problematic. But again, I think they've sort of made their own bed and now they have to lie in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know, Catherine, if there's any sort of questions from the crowd that we want to make sure we have time to get to.
No, we don't, but we are always open to answer questions afterwards. If anyone wants to get in touch with us on LinkedIn, send a message, Canary, we'll be pretty responsive. We do have a few more minutes left of your time. And I just wanted to open up, Angela, for you to say one line of encouragement for the HR leaders who are on this call. Like, your job is busy, it is complicated. There are a lot of things happening, a lot of them that we've talked about on this call. If anyone can take away like a summation that encourages them to go forward.
Yeah, for HR leaders in particular, take care of yourself. Right? We've been talking so much about community and wellness. Make sure that you have your own support system. We deal with so much good, but as we also know, there's some ugly to it. And it can be hard to get through. And because we have to be respectful of the confidentiality, of the sensitivity of those scenarios, we can't often find easy places to talk about them with someone who understands what we're going through. So make sure that you've got a network that you can lean on so that you can take care of yourself. Our own mental health, it's like put your mask on first. Make sure that you're okay so that you can take care of those around you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Angela and Meka, for this
Thank you for having
conversation.
me. Thank you, Meka. That was tough. That was tough. You had me thinking. You had me thinking. I can see why Rachel chose you. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I enjoyed the conversation. I hope everyone who attended did. Just a reminder, the recording will be shared afterward. Please feel free to share with any colleagues or HR peers who would find this helpful. And in the meantime, while you're waiting for the recording, feel free to follow Canary on LinkedIn or Twitter, where we're now active. So let's continue the conversation afterward. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Bye.